Hello and welcome to today's virtual Hinckley Forum. The Hinckley Institute of Politics is a nonpartisan institute at the University of Utah. The Hinckley provides an array of transformative experiences for students through internships, forums, and classes. Hinckley Forums seek to foster public discourse and civil debate on the most current and pressing issues, bringing in local, national, and international thought leaders. We would like to thank our media sponsor, KCPW, for recording and rebroadcasting our forums as part of the Hinckley Radio Hour. Today's forum is the future of political polls. Frank Pignanelli, partner at Foxley and Pignanelli, will moderate today's forum. He is joined by panelist Kyrene Gibb, partner and VP of research at Y2 Analytics, Baodong Liu, professor in the University of Utah Political Science Department, and Scott Rasmussen, political pollster and publisher of scottrasmussen.com. If you have any questions, please enter them in the YouTube chat. And with that, I will turn the time over to Frank Pignanelli.
Thank you, Ann. Thank you to everyone who is watching. We got a great panel today. It's about polling. For me, polling is a lot like chocolate for most politicos. We swear we're not going to look at them and we're not going to taste it, but we just can't help ourselves. And the media and the political community say, well, polls are this or that, but we love them. And just like we love chocolate. And so we're going to talk about why we can continue to have polling in this country and in this state, this community, and it's going to even continue to grow. So the first topic is, obviously there's been a lot of discussion both in 2016 and the 2020 national races. Why did the polling get it so wrong? Or did they get it wrong? Is this just a misnomer? Is this just a myth that needs to be busted right here, right now about polling? Scott, do you want to lead off on that?
Sure, and Frank, I have to challenge something you said right off the top. Politicos love polls that confirm what they want to see. I don't love them so much if they give different results. I mean, that is the process. And, that's just the nature of the beast. Polling has not been nearly as bad as the myth in the last couple of elections. The analysis of the polls was horrible, but the real numbers weren't nearly that bad. In 2016, which is the year allegedly of the big polling failure, the national polling average was off by just 1 point. They projected Hillary Clinton would win the popular vote by 3 points. She won by 2. If you looked at all of the state polls, the 3 big surprise states were Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. And in 2 of those states, Pennsylvania and Michigan, the final polling averages were were too close to call, so you really shouldn't have been assigning them either way. And in both of those states, the last poll ended up showing Donald Trump leading. So the polling wasn't too bad, but the problem is nobody in the political world believed it. The expectation was, okay, Clinton's up by 3 points in the polls. There's a margin of error. She's probably going to win by 6. And if I can just throw one more thing into kind of a sense of scale, in 2012, the year that Barack Obama beat Mitt Romney, the polling averages were off by more than 3 points, a far bigger error than we saw in 2016. Why wasn't it a big deal? Well, primarily because the polls showed Obama winning by just under a point, and he ended up winning by 4 points. So the winner was right. It was kind of what it's what I call analysis bias. They expected Obama to do a little better than the polls, and he did. So the polling itself is one part of the equation. The analysis is the other.
Great. Kyrene, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think Scott really hit the nail on the head there. As long as the race is called in the right direction, we're rarely criticized for the numbers in our polls. That margin of error and the uncertainty inherent in political polling and public opinion research is something that is subject to interpretation. And once those polls are publicized, once the media starts running headlines about the horse race and who's in the lead, regardless of that margin of error and whether that lead is within the margin of error, that's where we start to see things going off the rails. And in 2016 and in 2020, when those races were called in the wrong direction because we had a margin of error that was wider than the margin of victory, and the leader, according to those polls, with however slim that lead was, wasn't necessarily the winner at the end of the day, that's when we really come under fire for the work that we do. So I wholeheartedly agree. A lot of this comes down to how the polling is contextualized, how that data is framed, and whether or not we're willing to embrace the level of uncertainty that comes with public opinion research.
So, Professor, you look at this holistically. What does your academic research say about polling in the last, let's say, 5 to 6 years?
Well, I would like even to go back further. You know, it's not the first time the polling industry is under some kinds of attack. If you recall, our history has shown that sometimes polls give out some wrong prediction, like 1936 presidential election. And so people, I mean, scholars included, predicted that that would be the death penalty for the poll industry. You know what? It didn't happen. It will not happen. The polling industry is doing very well, and we are actually in the era of prosperity, so to speak.
Right. So is there, even though there's been some criticism of polling, but on the other hand, there's also been criticism, are we too obsessed with polls? And what are your thoughts about that? Are we obsessed with polls and market research this way?
We are overly obsessed with polls, and actually the transition from your last segment to this, 2008 brought about another horrible moment for polls. The polls showed that Barack Obama was going to win the New Hampshire primary, and he didn't. There were all kinds of strange things going on. And the morning after that primary mess up for the polling industry, I was interviewed on TV, and they were just beating me up about how can we ever trust polls again. And the last question in the interview was, so what do your polls tell us about Michigan for next week? There is an obsession, and it is like a sports event. And by the way, we end up seeing it. If your team is winning, you check the polls a lot more. You go online because you want to see everything about it. And I fear that when we focus on the numbers rather than the questions and what we can learn from them, we've already lost. One of the things that I've talked a lot about in the last year are these polls on socialism. And you know what? All the numbers are pretty close. You know, somewhere between 30 and 40% of Americans say they like the idea of socialism. And when you hear that in official Washington, if you're a member of Congress and you hear that, you think, wow, between 30 and 40% of the people are lined up with Bernie Sanders. But when you ask people who like socialism what they mean by it, it has nothing to do with what Bernie Sanders is talking about. 80% of people who like socialism believe in free markets. Only 1 out of 3 people who say they like socialism. Again, these are the fans of socialism. Only 1 out of 3 want to turn more power over to the government. Only 1 out of 3 think it would lead to higher taxes and more spending. Now, we don't quite know what they really have in mind. We got some theses about it, but basically what you see is people are being asked a question. They are thinking of a word in a different way than the person asking it, and you get a lot of confusion as a result. And I think that's something we have to be a lot more careful about. We must try always to ask questions in a way that somebody who doesn't live and breathe politics can understand.
And Karine, I know you've got an example about defunding the police that's close to that.
Yeah, I think so. When we think about the way questions are asked and what that means, the level of scrutiny that we apply to polls and the questions and the framing therein is probably not emphasized enough. So especially around the defund the police movement, which means something different to just about anyone you ask, levels of support for the defund the police movement varied drastically to levels of support for various issues potentially encapsulated in that movement. So when you asked Utah voters, for example, whether they supported funding community mental health programs and investing in police training to decrease bias, whether that's, preventable bias training or whether that's mental health support training, regardless of what those issues were, we saw dramatically different levels of support for those specific issues compared to the defund the police movement just by name. And I think it goes right along with what Scott was saying about socialism, how people interpret the words we use, whether they're familiar with the framing and the jargon that is so native to those of us who do live and breathe politics. That really influences how people answer the questions and whether we get the answers to the questions that we're really trying to ask. So simplifying that wording is important.
Professor, your thoughts on that?
Yes, I do agree that people are fascinated with polls, but is that too much? Well, that question has to be answered in regard to the human nature. I think two driving forces are making that happen in the first place. First is simply our curiosity, right? We know what we want most of the time, if not all the time, but we also want to know what other people want. And this is what we call population parameter. So all polls will help us understand what the population says outside of me. And that is simply human nature. So unless we can change human nature, polls will stay with us forever. The other reason is the polls give us some advantage to see from a sample to the population that cannot be replaced easily by other scientific methods, because we only need to study a sample from a big population. And the beautiful thing is, we don't have to have huge sample size all the time, even though we have to hit a certain level of sample size. But once you hit a certain level, if you go further to enlarge your sample size, it doesn't give you too much of the benefit. So the polls will help us understand the population. However, I do want to emphasize that we cannot blindly trust polls because if we don't do it the right way, then the polls will give us, bad results that do not reflect the true population parameters. So, and the enthusiasm will continue, and the industry will correct some of the mistakes that may happen in this particular era. And I'm very, positive that the polls will continue to fascinate not only Americans, but, the people around the world.
So one of the questions that's come up amongst political scientists is transparency and methodology of polling. So maybe we talk a little about that. Can we trust polls and are polls scientific? Scott, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, if you're asking the simple question, can we trust polls? The answer is yes, if they are done with careful parameters to get a representative sample. And one of the ways you get that is you have to disclose how you are doing your survey, how you are getting a sample, and what does your sample look like. But when you talk about it, can you trust the polls? There's something else that I think is really important to get at. All the arguments, Kyrene mentioned some of the things earlier, maybe we're a point or two off, but as long as we're in the right direction in an election poll, nobody cares. But think about it this way. If we do a poll and we're off by 3 points in one of the candidates in an election, that can make you look really good or really bad. If we do another poll and we find out that 70% of Americans believe something, a certain position on immigration or on some other issue, maybe we're wrong. Maybe it's 72% or 68%. But what we're still showing is the broad sense of where the public is. And that's something we can't lose sight of. And getting back to the professor's point, I think we need to recognize that one of the purposes of polling is to understand how people not like us view the world. We need to learn from that because our friends think the way we do. Sometimes our family does too. Polls can help us see people in different circumstances, and that's why they have to be trusted. And again, the sense of election polling, we do pretty well as an industry, but that's not the major purpose. The major purpose is to help us understand the American people. And on that, we have a very good track record as long as we ask the right questions.
Okay, Kyrene, not only do you obviously as an officer and partner company, but also you're involving as a millennial pollster. So, what are your thoughts regards to what Scott said there about trusting polls? And
Yeah, so one of my favorite criticisms of public opinion research that we see pop up in open-ended comments at various points in some of our surveys is that, you know, if the results of this data don't match my opinion, don't confirm my bias, then it must not be accurate. And I think that speaks directly to Scott's point that, you know, trusting the polls is helpful in broadening our perspective. I will say that some of the things that as a polling industry, we need to be more careful about be intentional about communicating the methodology we use with each of our polls. Who was our intended audience? How did we reach that intended audience? And then what questions did we ask? What time frame? All of these things, all of this context matters to how well polls can be interpreted and communicated to your average consumer of this type of public opinion data. And I think when those things are communicated clearly and people are able to easily and accessibly interpret the data, we can trust polls. That level of transparency, though, is critical to being able to trust that data and therefore broaden our perspectives accurately.
And Frank, sometimes Kyrene's company and mine might do a poll in Utah and come up with results that look really different. And usually what happens in that case is people that like her results say she's really the best pollster in the world. And people who like my results say I am, because that's, again, they want to confirm your biases. What we really need to do in that circumstance is look, did we ask the same questions? And if not, what do you learn from the difference between that question wording? And what does that gap tell us, you know, about how strong people's opinions are? I think any scientifically designed poll that you have transparency on how it was done tells you something. You can learn from it. And again, it's not a question of picking whether Kyrene's poll or mine is better or somebody else's is better. They all teach us something, and collectively they teach us even more.
Absolutely. It shouldn't be a question of who's right or wrong. It should be a question of what was the question being asked and to whom. And those things, when taken in context and interpreted holistically, do tell us different things about various audiences. If I'm looking at a likely voter sample and someone else is looking at a registered voter sample, well, how do those things vary? How did we arrive at who's a likely voter? All of this matters to interpreting polling data. And again, it teaches us more about the scope of public opinion broadly when we're not looking to point fingers or cast doubt on various polls.
so you're indicating a real science in polling. And so, Professor, are polls scientific?
Yeah, speaking of trust, I very often encounter this kind of question, not only from my own students, but also sometimes from my colleagues. Can we trust polls? Well, if you can trust gravity, then you are trusting something scientific, right? So all polls are built on a central limit theorem, which will continue to exist no matter whether we trust it or not, just like gravity. So, but you know, people tend to make mistakes when they consume the news or information regarding poll results. Why? Because they pay more attention to what we call the point estimates, which is simply a measurement of the best guess given the data. But all polls have a margin of error. So a critical consumer of polls should ask not only the point estimates, but also the margins of error in different polls. And the central limit theorem is so powerful, no matter whether you trust it or not, it's because it gives us a way to imagine how wrong or how off our point estimation can be. So whenever we see a margin of error, we should look at the lowest point and the highest point, and think about a confidence interval associated with it. And when you look at different polls with different points, point estimation and different margin of error, then you can make a best judgment about what polls to trust more. And of course, like my colleague Scott and Karin said, you need to look at their methodology itself. Is there a chance of selection bias, for example? If they did not do it based on probability sampling, then obviously you need to raise some question. And before you trust whatever brand name in the industry, you ask whether selection bias took place in the way they did the sampling, and but also the response bias, how it was done. And therefore, you look at, for example, whether it is by, say, a mail survey or a web survey or landline telephone survey or mixed methods, whatever that is, you need to look at how the sample would give everybody an equal probability of being selected in the sample in the first place. So I think it is a great time for us, all of us, only those of us as educators or industry leaders, but also the general public, to know how the central limit theorem works and why we can trust, just like we trust gravity itself.
You know, as you bring that up, I think we as pollsters and as an industry bear some of the blame for the distrust. Too many times we go out and say, well, this race, so-and-so is winning by 2 points. He's definitely ahead. When we should be saying this race is too close to call. We need to think about the way we present things. This last year I began a practice of releasing 3 different turnout models. And the whole point wasn't that my 3 models were perfect. It was to convey a sense that if turnout is a little bit different, you're going to see a different winner or a different margin. And you want to convey that uncertainty. And look, every pollster ever has gone into a conversation when they know they can bring it to a halt and win the argument by saying 63% of people disagree with you. But you know what? That's not the purpose. That's not what we're supposed to be doing. We need to convey, if a poll shows 63% believe something, we should say, a majority of people think this, a big chunk of people, and here's some demographic breakdowns. We shouldn't be saying this number is precise. And I think the more that we can actively convey the uncertainty, most people, you talk about margin of error, you talk about numbers, their eyes glaze over. They don't want to know that. They want to know, what does your poll tell me? And therefore, we have a responsibility to present that information in the best context and in the best way, so that somebody hearing our explanation gets a good understanding of what we see, because we do like the numbers and do like to study the margin of error.
And one thing that I'll add to that, and sort of going back to the professor's point about the central limit theorem, the more divided the public is on an issue, the more uncertainty we're going to see in our polling measurements. So it's important to understand that, when we're looking at a margin of error, when we're releasing our polling data, given various scenarios or subgroups within the population that we're examining, understanding that confidence interval and the context therein is critical to understanding the polling data and the implications of that data for whatever decision is being made or what story we're telling. I think some of my former media partners have been frustrated with me when I'm harping on them to make sure that we're talking about, this race is too close to call, or this person has a really narrow lead, or a majority of Utah voters feel this way, but it's not unanimous by any means. And this is not a foregone conclusion. Contextualizing our numbers in ways that are accessible to people who aren't numbers people is really critical for pollsters, and I think for those who are communicating polling results.
Yeah, there are 2 basic components when you talk about margin of error. The first is the variation component, so to speak. It is about how the population is split in the first place, like Karin said. If it's a 50-50 or 49-51, then you're likely to see some sampling error in the first place. Why? Because just imagine you have a box of ping pong balls. If inside the box it's 50-50, then the next ball you draw out of the box may be black, maybe white. It happened by chance. So every poll will give you some uncertainty to begin with. And the other is sample size. The sample size is in the denominator, so the larger the better. But again, when you reach a certain level, it's diminishing return. You don't want to have, just for the sample size sake, to enlarge sample size to infinite, So the two components work together to give you the margin of error. So we tend to forget sometimes because of the nature of the problem itself, i.e. the population parameter itself. For instance, voting. In voting business these days, the division between Democrats and Republicans has arrived to a level of almost evenly split in a lot of elections. Not all elections, not all state and local election, but national election. So therefore, you may have margin of error that is larger than you wanted. So when you look at that, you do not blame it on pollsters, so to speak. You are asking what the population is thinking about whom to vote in the first place. If the population says 50-50, then obviously different polls will give you different results. And also another very important thing to remember is the public opinion itself may fluctuate over time. So, the polls that are done today may be a little bit different from tomorrow. It depends on what questions you raise. Some of the questions are more enduring than others, like party identification question. Pretty much we know before we even do the poll. But in terms of how voters will vote in a particular election, that can vary by month, sometimes by weeks, sometimes even by days. So we need to put that in mind when we evaluate poll results.
As I'm listening to this conversation, probably somebody who's not on this panel is thinking we're saying two opposite things. We're saying you should trust polls, and then you should put all this uncertainty in it. And that is a little bit of the line we have to straddle. Polls can give you a good sense of where you are, but they are not hyper precise. The idea that in a race like Utah 4, where it's a 1 point gap between the two candidates, a poll on the day before the election or the week before the election is not going to tell you with certainty who wins, because in a 1 point race, when you've got a 3 or 4 point margin of error, it's not the right tool for that job. I think that, and the other part that we're a little bit sliding over here, yes, polls on elections, you need to treat with a little more skepticism, give a wider range to the category of too close to call. Polls on issues, we want to look at the broad sense of where the numbers are, and you want to compare different polls and learn things. But when you get into the other thing that you have to remember is this is a very difficult process. When I began polling, it was before the internet. I think George Washington had just finished his first term, and getting into things, and we're now trying to deal with new technologies. But one of the biggest shifts is not in the technology. It's in this idea that in the 80s and especially in the 70s, all Americans shared a little bit of a common bond. In the 70s, 94% of the audience watched one of 3 networks. So we had a common cultural base. Also, we had a much more homogenous society than we do today. And these are big challenges. And just to give you a sense of an emerging challenge, when we talk about race and ethnicity, it's not as simple as it seems. You know, Kyrene was going to put out information on the demographic makeup of her sample, and I will do the same thing. But we now know that one of the fastest growing categories are mixed race, mixed ethnicities in families. And the Census Bureau is struggling with how to figure that out. So how do you model on this? The point is we have a lot of work to do to continue making polls trustworthy. Some of it has to do with making sure the polls are used for the right purpose. Some of it has to do with us presenting the data in a manner that reflects the reality of the numbers. And some of it means we still have to keep working on the best way to get a representative sample.
So uncertainty of the population seems to be a factor to consider on all this. Yeah, but there's been some talk, is the nation really that divided? Or are people really that divided? Because you've got the extremes, but there seems to be polling that demonstrates that a lot of people share the same values. So is the nation really that divided?
Yeah, if I can give you just some discussions that in the literature from the political science perspective, a major opponent against the cultural divide thesis is from Morris Fiorina, a Stanford professor, who argued that it is too much to even argue that America is really deeply divided or polarized. In his view, that actually it is the super elites that are polarized. The general public itself is not that polarized. He gave a lot of survey data to back that up, mainly through the American National Election Study series. Every 4 years in the presidential election, every 2 years in the congressional election, he proved that the independents actually are growing more than the pure Democratic or Republican affiliations. Therefore, it's not really that divided. But other scholars, a lot of scholars in the area of race and ethnicity, class, gender issues, environmental issues, and so on and so forth, they do present a lot of great empirical evidence about this great divide. So how do we really want to consume these seemingly conflicting arguments and sometimes persuasive empirical data? My take is that we should not take an either or approach. It depends on what questions you raise, right? Again, back to Scott's original statement, is this a good question to use polls to study in the first place? Some questions are indeed difficult to study by using polls because of the great divide, the nature of the population shift, and especially the nature of racial conflicts and so on and so forth. Other times, it's much easier when you deal with homogeneous population and so on and so forth. So the questions are important to ask about what are the population we are talking about. If we are talking about, partisan fight to begin with, obviously you will see great divide. But if you are talking about general public in terms of entertainment business or marketing strategies, information era related to how we consume products, other types of questions, you don't see a great divide at all. Sometimes you do see the country can be united. Even in some political issues, people may be united, but sometimes timing matters as well. So I think it is pretty premature to jump into conclusion to say, yes, the population is divided on every issue or other way. So we have to be more cautious in making assertion one way or another.
I also think when it comes to whether the population is divided and truly divided, it's worth asking whether we're thinking about polling as an absolute when we're really looking at one data point. A poll, the results of one poll, for example, are the results of the answers to a question at one snapshot in time. Now, as we've sort of talked about a little bit, there are considerations that can move public opinion. Public opinion is not necessarily an absolute on all issues. And there are some issues that are a little bit more consistent, and we see over time, looking at the trends in a question asked year over year or month over month, where there are some divisions, some consistent patterns. But I think when we look at most questions of policy, of outcomes, we actually find that most of the general public, regardless of where their information source is coming from, we have some pretty polarizing media sources and outlets where people are really embracing their echo chamber. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, unless we assume that those outlets are reflective of some great conflict or tension in the American public that isn't really there. And when we get down to the grassroots, and when we're talking to a representative sample of Americans, for example, on an issue, we actually find that there is a little bit of more of a normal distribution. There are a lot of the people who fall in the middle on an issue and don't have strong or polarized opinions on most things.
You know, when I hear this, what we're leaving out of the discussion so far is the sense of intensity. If you all ask me something about who's going to win March Madness, you know what? I don't really have a strong opinion. However, if we start talking about baseball and you tell me anybody but the Yankees are going to win the World Series this year, I'm going to be really upset. I'm going to fight with you. And I think we end up in that situation with a lot of political things. The last 9 presidential elections in a row, nobody's won more than 53% of the vote. We used to have landslides on a regular basis. So if nobody's winning more than 53%, that says, wow, America is divided. And yeah, when it comes to pulling the lever for an R or D for president, it's pretty evenly split, pretty consistently. But our polling throughout the Trump years found that 26% of voters said things wouldn't be all that much different if Hillary Clinton had won the election. So here you have a president that people are talking about is polarizing and getting people, you either love him or you hate him. And yet 1 out of 4 voters say at the end of the day, it wouldn't make much difference. That tells me, and actually like the professor said, there's some dispute at the elite level. There's 2 polarized armies that do see each other as the real enemy. A lot of Americans say, yeah, if you force me to decide, I'm with this side or I'm with that side, but mostly I want to keep my head down so that I don't get caught in the crossfire. And they begin to look for other things that go on in life. And we've done a lot of polling over the years showing that in terms of core values, there's a lot of common ground. In terms of belief about the way people conduct themselves in day-to-day life, there's a lot of common ground and a lot of optimism. It's only when you get it into the political sphere that you have this sense of division. And part of that, again, I hate to admit this, but part of that pollsters are to blame for, because our numbers show you where the divides come. Back in the 90s, I began asking questions about government employees versus private sector workers. And guess what? There's a gap. Government workers are more supportive of bigger government programs and higher taxes. So is that a fight? Is that a deep fight in the American public? No, it's a way of looking at the public, but it's not something that people are fighting about on a day-to-day basis.
Great. I have a question here, audience question. Should campaigns do their own internal polling or hire unbiased sources? Is the question. So I guess that's making the statement that is a pollster that's hired by media outlet biased, and of course I think we would say no. But what about internal polling versus the polling that's done by a media source or some other external source?
Internal polling should be biased, not in the polling data, but you should want your candidate to win. So if you're hired by a campaign, your job is to provide them with marketing information and demographic information and ways to get their message out. You don't want somebody to offer an academic or a public polling perspective on your campaign. You want them to say, if I'm at 43% today and I need to get a few more points, where's it come from? What am I going to do to change? Or how am I going to message in my upcoming digital ad campaign or whatever it might be? That's a fundamentally different purpose and objective than public polling.
And Kyrene, could you talk about that too? Because both your company, Scott's, a lot of people hire you to do internal polling for their public affairs campaigns because they want to know what to message to move that up and have the opponents move down.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the key is your poll results should be unbiased. How you go about gathering that data should be unbiased. But your goals in gathering that data can be biased by your client. So just exactly like Scott said, if I'm working for a campaign, I'm going to have strategic objectives in my public opinion research. That's not going to change my sampling approach. That's not going to change utilizing various modes to ensure that I have the best coverage of the underlying population possible, because I want to make sure that that strategic data that I'm giving a campaign is accurate. It reflects the population to the best of my ability. But when I'm working for a public media outlet and I'm doing public polling, I don't want it to be accused of being slanted in favor of one candidate or another. And therefore, my objectives are different. The questions I ask might be different. I'm not going to ask messaging questions to see what makes people view a campaign more favorably compared to another. But I do think that as long as your methods are unbiased, they can address various research objectives. So that's, whether that happens inside the campaign or from an outside source, I think is less critical than what methods you're taking and whether that's a scientific representative data gathering method.
Yeah, Kyrene, I think there's two things that come up from your answer that I agree with. First, whenever you hear a leaked private poll from a campaign, you should be suspicious. And the reason you should be suspicious is not that they did a lousy poll, it's because they're leaking it for a purpose. What the purpose is depends on the campaign, but anytime an internal campaign poll is leaked, keep your guard up. That's number one. And number two, if you don't do what Kyrene said, and you're working for a campaign or for a corporation or a public affairs department, and you don't have a good sample and you don't produce good results, you won't keep the client. You have to have that sampling work has to be good.
Professor, any thoughts before we move on to the next question?
Yeah, another way to think about this question is about whether or not people, ordinary people, may be affected by polls itself. A lot of internal polls are questionable because what we call push polls. That is the purpose of doing change people's mind. So for campaign-related polls, push polls is to try to persuade voters to vote for their candidates. And they pretend they are doing polls. And that is obviously something that has drawn question all over the political science field because they are using polls as a tool, not the scientific method to gather information. However, there has been a lot of empirical data to show that polls indeed do affect voters' political opinions. And sometimes, some polls in terms of how they phrase their question, the order of the questions they raise and so on, they indeed have influence on people's mind. But the good news is that that impact has only limited reach. And thank goodness, most of us in the population are not affected by polls because of our predispositions of our political ideology or whatever. And therefore, there are just certain segment of population that may be affected by the so-called push polls. And for campaign organizations, obviously, even if they want to do push polls, there is cost involved because if they just blindly exercise that, they may waste a lot of resources. And at the end, they don't really reach the people that they have a chance to affect outcome in the first place. So for that matter, I guess it's a fair game.
We have a couple other questions, but I'd like to combine it. One is the impact COVID has had on polling and voter activity and the use of cell phones and declining. I'm wondering if we can tie that, the impact of COVID, the impact of use of cell phones, and maybe throw in what alternatives you're doing, like with big data and things like that. I know that's kind of a loaded question, but they actually kind of have the same theme. You can respond to that, especially the two practitioners. Scott, do you want to lead out on that?
Sure. The first impact of COVID was great. People answered the phone more. People responded to surveys more. It was exciting. Although that's been wearing off a little bit. But COVID, in terms of an impact on the election polling, presented an enormous challenge to everybody. And the challenge, broadly understood, is that we tend to look at the way things have been done to model the way we're going to view the world. We had never seen the levels of mail-in voting that we saw this year. And especially, now Utah, that's not a big deal. Pennsylvania, it was a big deal. Michigan, it was a big deal. They didn't know how to handle that volume. So when you're trying to do a poll based on a situation you've never seen before, what you can do is say, wow, look at the numbers. People who are voting by mail are really overwhelmingly for Biden. People who are going to vote in person on election day are overwhelmingly for Trump. Therefore, we can predict that the outcome will be determined by the mix. How many people actually show up and vote on election day, and how many people mail in their ballots? And, related questions like how many of those mail-in ballots will be invalidated for various reasons. So this was an enormous challenge because, again, it's an unprecedented circumstance. And I tried to write about it and talk about it ahead of time. One of the predictions I'm happiest about in a I guess perverse sort of way is from weeks before the election, I was pointing out that this is going to create a bad situation for America. Donald Trump is going to look like he's ahead in a big way. The mail-in votes are going to go for Biden, and one of two outcomes is going to happen. Either Biden surpasses him, in which case the Trump voters won't believe it, or Biden voters won't believe it if his numbers fall short. That train wreck was foreseeable, but it's all that we could do. So that's, I think the impact of COVID in the short term was very much in creating a lot more uncertainty.
How about you, Kyrene? Your thoughts on
Yeah,
that?
it was also really interesting the types of voters that were more likely to respond during the most severe lockdowns, the most severe shutdowns. People who were staying home were systematically different in ways that we understand along political lines, along socioeconomic lines. But so while we saw an increase in response rates, we saw people who were more excited to take surveys and just talk to someone or have an outlet for their opinions that they maybe didn't have now that they were stuck at home. It wasn't evenly distributed across the whole of the population. So we saw, I think, a lot more response bias in some of our survey results, and had to do more weighting on the back end to ensure that our samples were still representative when we're not seeing as many responses from various subgroups in the population. Even if our response rate is great and we're getting hundreds of people who want to answer surveys, hundreds of people who are systematically different from the population as a whole isn't necessarily good for public opinion data. So it presented some challenges and some opportunities that we had to overcome. And eventually, through the course of the pandemic over the last year, we did see that initial boost in response rates fall off. But it also was an interesting opportunity to explore a variety of survey modes. And I think this ties into the question about the use of cell phones or the declining response rates via cell phones. As we're pursuing more mixed mode surveys and using the data that's available about voters and the wealth of data that each of us generates every day sort of our internet paper trail about ourselves. All of those things make us more accessible, more easy to identify and segment as a population. And I think moving forward, as we learn to use that data to leverage various survey modes and learn how to access various groups in the population where they are, that provides an opportunity for polling to become much more accurate. And over time, while certainly right now we're still grappling with which modes to use to reach which portions of the population and how to ensure that we're not imposing some bias in our sample design or our mixed mode approach, I think there are certainly opportunities going forward for all of these things to be beneficial to the polling industry.
You know, Kyrene, when you talked about the early days of the pandemic, one of the most interesting segmentation things that we did was we identified how many people were working at home and only seeing people on Zoom versus how many people were regularly out at a job with customers or coworkers, and then a mixed group in between. And they had fundamentally different views of the pandemic. So that was an interesting piece of the puzzle. In terms of your question or the comments about what mode do you want to use or how do we find these people, I think it's important to recognize that when phone polling began, when what we know as the gold standard of phone polling began, people talked on the phone all the time. You know, my Nana would say, shh, it's long distance, because, you know, you had to take that call. And I remember the technology, this new high-tech thing of answering machines we were upset about because people didn't have to pick up the phone all the time. What we have now, if I were to call one of my sons today, just call them, the first thing they would say is mom all right? Because nobody calls. You don't. So the idea that just by calling cell phones, all of a sudden we have a better approach. No, we need to find people in the manner in which they're used to talking. And that's very difficult because a 65-year-old in rural Utah communicates very differently from a 25-year-old in Manhattan. And we need to find ways to connect with all those segments in the way that they are comfortable, not in the way that we think it should be, in the way that they think they feel like, yes, I know how to do this. I can give you my answers.
Yeah, in my most recent grant, which I serve as a principal investigator, we did take a look at how probably COVID-19 affected the 2020 presidential election. We started out by looking at the primaries, and especially the 5 states that used the ranked choice voting. And for instance, Nevada, that was early on the primary schedule. Early voting indeed was determined by casting ballots and mail out. And it's actually early voting in Nevada, in addition to the caucus. What we found is that indeed increased the turnout among the Democratic primary voters. And then we look at 4 other states like Wyoming, Kansas, you know, some red states in the Democratic primaries. Indeed, COVID-19 not only didn't prevent voters from participating, but enlarging the turnout. And so it is mesmerizing, to say the least, to look at how Americans were so enthusiastic in the unprecedented crisis of public health. COVID-19 somehow, I mean, scholars will spend years studying this, how this country pulled off this amazing democracy, this election. So the quick answer is that COVID-19 didn't decrease the turnout, it increased turnout, but whether it is related to ranked choice voting available to the 5 states that I was talking about, or mail voting as a way out of Pennsylvania and other places, that remained to be seen. But it is absolutely mesmerizing to see how our democracy is still alive and prosper in this crisis.
So we just have a couple minutes left. And so in the last few minutes, could each of you, we've gone full circle. We start out like, why are all the polls screwed up? And now we're at the end of the hour. Let's talk a little bit about your optimism of polling in the future. If we could start with that. Kyrene, do you want to talk? Are you optimistic?
Yeah, I would say I am optimistic about the future of polling and the opportunities for the polling industry. I think, as I mentioned, sort of the ability to leverage various types of technology and all of the data that is available to us as pollsters about the population we're reaching out to really means that we can more accurately reach people where they are, more reliably reach people where they are, whether that's a text to online poll, whether that's calling someone on the phone. I think there are so many different modes and technologies available to us that we can use. And when we couple those modes and different avenues for gathering data with the data that we already have, with the data that we can access about voters to teach us how to reach them and when best to reach them, I think that means that there is a bright future ahead for public opinion research.
Scott, as the old hand here, what are your thoughts?
Well, I'm very optimistic as well. One reason is because the traditional era of phone polling is clearly behind us. We've been going through a transition, and transitions are hard in any industry. So we are grappling with the things Kyrene was talking about how to reach people, but we do have a better ability to do it. And the other reason I'm optimistic about the polling part of it is because there are so many public polling outlets. There's a lot of competition forcing us all to stay on our toes. It is hard for people who are younger today to understand how little polling was done in the 1980s and 90s. I think when Tip O'Neill was Speaker of the House of Representatives, for the entire time, there were like 3 or 4 national polls done on him. Whereas Nancy Pelosi probably has a public poll every week coming out about her. The idea of tracking in a public manner a presidential race on a daily basis didn't exist. So we are in a new and very competitive era. And we are experimenting with lots of new technologies. And whether it's for public polling or for private clients, we have a very strong incentive to figure out how to use these capabilities. And there will always be mistakes. There will always be times when our polls are either wrong or misinterpreted. But on the whole, polling is better today than it was in the 80s and 90s. And it will be better a decade from now.
So, Professor, why don't you wrap this up for us about your optimism in polling?
Yes, I completely agree with my fellow panelists. I am super optimistic for 2 reasons. One is theory. We know much more today about public opinion than in the past. We know how public opinions can be formed and can be sustained, can be changed. We know much more about why people change their mind, if possible, and so on. That theoretical development from, scholarly world will help us to design better future plans to do more surveys, to tap into how at the fundamental level the population shifts to one way or another. The other reason is, like my fellow panelists already addressed, that is the technology. We indeed are in this new era, and the big data itself helps. For example, the GitHub has 120 million repositories to address all kinds of issues concerning how we do better technologically by writing better codes in our software or web applications and so on. Python, R, everything can help us to analyze data almost instantly and remodel our survey techniques and methods one way or another. And finally, I would also add, and hopefully I can also remind my fellow panelists, that is, some of the old methods are indeed too old, and they are pretty much gone, like a landline telephone survey. In the past, we argued it's so popular and powerful because, between 7 and 9 p.m., people sitting at the dinner table, usually you call them, you can get good response rate, right? And, but that old technology also give you a response bias because typically it's, white, female, middle class respondents that are more likely to answer the phones and not other people, like young people or too old. So all methods have their own internal problems. So as we are missing the good old days, we should not be like too pessimistic. Something new can happen. And in doing so, we can still use some of our old methodology, including going to the place to do person-to-person interview, by the way. For example, if you want to know in a small town, like 6,000 residents, whether to build a public park, well, go to the neighborhood and talk to them and just, get the sample. The GIS will tell you how to draw the sample very quickly and just go to the neighborhood and talk to them. I did that 20 years ago, and I still believe that is one of the best methods ever.
Well, thank you.
That's available. So.
Thank you, Professor. We want to thank Kyrene Gibb with Y2 Analytics. We want to thank you, of course, to Professor Baidong Liu, who's a professor of political science, and of course, Scott Rasmussen, well-known political pollster. And we want to thank the Hinckley Institute for promoting this. And we want to thank you, the audience, for watching this. The Hinckley Institute does a great job of distributing information across the state, across the region, to help those who are interested in politics, those interested in campaigns, and those interested in public policy. And we want to thank you as an audience for participating.
All right, we're off.